Stephanie Otey here from Vegas Insider. We have a lot of college hoops to get to. NBA basketball's heating up. The regular season with college hoops is winding down, so March Madness is right around the corner. We're officially in March as well. Conference play is starting to come to a close. We're seeing some tournaments starts begin. Lots of action to get to talk about all that with me. I have Mark Drumheller on from Yahoo Sports, and you can catch him on Fox Sports, The Gambler in Philadelphia. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Stephanie, thanks so much for having me. And like you said, this is just a tremendous time of year. We're ramping up towards the NBA playoffs. We have about a month and a half left, and then getting right into March Madness with college basketball. I can't wait. I mean, these next couple months, such a great way to pivot away from football season to get into the hardwood.
Yeah, and I don't know if you were like me, but I had a rough February. I mean, I'm from Ohio, so I clearly wanted the Bengals. I went all in on Joe Burrow, and we had a little bit more February football, and then like my bets in basketball started to flop. So I'm ready for March to begin. I don't know if you had a rough February, but I'm excited to start fresh and have tons of games to bet on just so I can recoup here.
Yeah, it's always tough to transition. When you move from football season, you start getting into basketball season. One of the things I like to compare it to is, football coaches will always talk about, when tight ends are blocking, they just don't want them to lose big, right? They just want them to slow down the defender a little bit. And that's how I feel like with my bankroll in February when I'm starting to dive into these college sports, college basketball, and the NBA is I just want to kind of test the waters in February to get ramped up for March so we can, make some money and have some fun.
Yeah, that's a good point. So is that a strategy you do? Are you more conservative in February with your basketball betting?
I am, yeah. With my unit sizes, when I'm just getting started, absolutely. Especially because, like, this year in the NBA, it was, a lot of motivational factors went into it, right? Because the All-Star break was approaching right away. So you had to kind of deal with that and which teams were, you had the trade deadline, that activity, and then, the All-Star break. But now we're past that. We're kind of zeroed in. We can see which teams are dialed in to kind of making a push to the playoffs. And with college basketball, same thing. A little bit smaller unit sizes just to kind of get in there, test the waters, and, prepare ourselves for what is probably the greatest event in sports betting in March for sure, the March Madness.
Definitely. And we talked about it before we came on. It's hard to get to so many basketball games. So once we get to the tournament, you can dial in on select teams and things like that. But like you mentioned, the All-Star break, it was very pivotal this year in the NBA. The blockbuster trade with James Harden, I think that was going to be huge in the East. We'll get to that later. But going back to a rough February to start with March not being the greatest on the 1st of March, my Buckeyes had a brutal loss to Nebraska. Kevin and I talked about this one on Tuesday. We thought that 15-point spread was just too long for us to take. And then Nebraska tops them by 8 points. What did you make of that game?
Yeah, it's surprising because it's like, you look at Ohio State and they're just really struggling defensively lately. I think they've moved just in the past 2 weeks from, 84th in defensive efficiency all the way down to, I think they're at like 119th right now. So really struggling on the defensive end. EJ Liddell really has to do everything offensively. They don't have a ton of weapons like outside of him. So just very reliant on him to get the job done offensively. And without that defense, it just lets teams hang around. And that's when you see these upsets happen.
Yeah. And so the Buckeyes, they have a game tonight. Michigan State also has been struggling. Ohio State is still favored by 6.5 in this one. Michigan State, once we thought they had things figured out and they have the upset over Purdue, Michigan tops them by 17 points. They've lost 4 of their last 5 overall, an ugly 26-point loss, blowout to Iowa. It's been a struggle for them. They're 1-5 in their last 6 on the road. The only win that came during that time was only a 2-point win over a struggling Maryland team. Who are you liking in this one? Are you able to take a bet? I can never bet on Ohio State hoops. It's just too inconsistent, too unreliable for me.
Yeah, I agree. Very inconsistent. And both these teams, you look at them, Ohio State, Michigan State, you typically don't want to back either of them, right? You kind of stay away from them, especially in these roles. But I like Michigan State tonight. I think this number is a little big at 6.5. Offensively, they got to kind of spread it around, right? They really don't have anybody that can take over the game. But I think against this defense, we talked about Ohio State, the Buckeyes, the problems they're having on the defensive end of the floor. I think they're going to get enough scoring to keep this game close. It's a big game for Ohio State. They're on their home court. They're going to be ready to play. But I think unless they can pick it up defensively, I just can't justify laying this type of number at 6.5 against Michigan State here. So this is more of a play off Ohio State and their defense than it is, feeling like Michigan State's a strong team in general. But I do like them to cover this number at 6.5.
Mm-hmm. Ohio State will also enter this one a bit beaten up. Forward Zed Key, he injured his ankle against Maryland, did not play Tuesday against Nebraska. That's a significant loss for the Buckeyes defense. He didn't play most of that Maryland game, and then the Terrapins and the Huskers, without him in that game, they were able to score 47.7% on Ohio State. That I think will be a key figure there. Kyle Young stepped in for him. He only played 8 minutes, and then he had illness. He should be back against Michigan State. So I think that'd be a lot for Little to bear if they're both out. But you got two guys on Ohio State who can put up 30, it looks like, in Branham and Little if he can play. I have the over on this one. I just think that both teams will be able to put up a lot of points. 3 of Michigan State's last 4 reached 146. And the total right now is at 138.5. So I think I'll take the over on this one. I just can't go with the Buckeyes. I think that they are too unreliable. And Michigan State has been so up and down as well. And they're also the reason why I had a miserable bracket last year. So I'm not able to pick a side on that one, but I do like the over. Looking at another game tonight, I know you're looking at Houston and Temple. Houston is the clear leader of the AAC as of late. They are the AAC regular season champion 3 of the last 4 years. They run the AAC, and the Cougars, they were defeated by Memphis just 3 weeks ago, snapped his 37-game win streak, against Memphis. So I think that they might be caught looking ahead. Do you think that might be a struggle for them as they look to the Memphis game on Sunday?
I hope not. I mean, I'm laying the points here with the Cougars. Houston's a team that I just fell in love with last year. Like, I love the way they played. I had a future on them to actually, win the national championship last year. Came up a little bit short. I had them in Gonzaga. So Baylor kind of beat me on both ends with those plays last season. But again, Houston, same type of team, right? Very efficient on both ends of the floor, top 20, top 30 in efficiency, offensively and defensively. They do all the things. They beat you up on the glass. They create turnovers. The defense is just going to be very tough for a Temple team to handle that really can't score. I think they are 138th in offensive efficiency, and I think they're outside of the 200 in points per game. So the Temple offense really in a bad matchup here against the Houston defense. So I think Houston can get the job done. If you look at Houston since that Memphis loss, 4 of their 5 wins have been by 14 points or more. 2 of the wins by 14, 2 of them by 18. So, they can win with margin, especially against a team that can't score like Temple. So I like the Cougars here. I think they roll in a big rout against Temple.
Yeah, you mentioned it. Efficient, both ends of the ball. Top 15 offensive and defensive efficiency. They've outscored their opponents by an average of 18 points per game. That's the 3rd highest mark in the country. That's impressive. Temple, they're looking to win one of their final 2 matchups against Houston or South Florida, just so that they can get a top 5 seed and avoid the first round matchup. Temple's shooting has been a struggle this year, ranking outside the top 300 in the nation in 2-point and 3-point shooting. I'm with you. I think Houston is the side to take. And so Temple's success, they haven't had certainty defensively, ranking top 25 in both 2-point. Speaking of Houston, they're in the top 25, as you mentioned. So I think that when you look at the bottom tier versus the top tier, it's an easy one for me. Looking at strategy for the brackets coming up, that's when everybody starts to pay attention to college hoops. There's a few teams that, like Kevin and I have talked a lot, like, are they for real? Purdue is one that I just can't go all in on. What is your take on Purdue this year? Are they the true leader of the Big Ten?
I think they might be the best team in the Big Ten when they're on, right? But the problem is with Purdue, and you'll see this with some of the other teams that we can talk about, just, so heavy offensively, not so heavy defensively. So when you talk about the tournament and you get into March Madness and you have to win, 6 games in a row, what's going to happen when the shots don't go down? You're playing in different venues. You're not playing these games at home. So it's difficult, I think, to back a team like that to go, really far in the tournament when they really have to rely on what they do offensively. And if they can't get the job done offensively, then they're going to stall out and they could get caught by some of these lower teams. So I think when you look at March Madness and you attack, like, which teams do you want to back? We talked about Houston. I think that if you take teams that kind of have success on both ends of the floor that might not even be the top teams, right? You can look at Houston out of the American, another team like Texas in the Big 12, very high efficiency on both sides of the floor. Those teams, like, if they're not shooting well, they can count on their defense, right? Or vice versa, right? If they're not defending well, they have the ability to get buckets against tough teams. So I like to kind of attack those teams a little bit more. And I especially think when you look at the teams like Texas and Arkansas that really are pretty good, even Illinois, a team in the Big Ten, I think they really have staying power in the tournament, and they're really good bets because you don't have to bet them to go all the way. Really good bets to get into that, Sweet 16 area or Elite Eights. Those are kind of like my favorite futures, is kind of just taking the teams that, hey, can they win 1 or 2 games by the way that they're built in this tournament type structure?
Yeah, so looking at your bracket once you get started, just to help with some tips for people when they start to build their bracket, looking at things that have never happened versus have, or it's rare. Like, one thing that I notice, usually you should take 2 top seeds to go to the Final Four. That's one thing that I usually look at. Obviously, we've only seen a 16 seed beat the 1 seed one time in history. What are some things that stand out to you that you should just clearly avoid, or some that you should definitely take into consideration when building your bracket?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point because it is, we all enjoy the Cinderella stories, right? When they happen and the teams that come out of nowhere and they start making a move in the tournament. But in reality, year after year, those teams kind of fade out after the Elite Eight, right? And we get into the Final Four. It's usually the best of the best that actually get there. And so I think, when you're looking at your bracket, you don't want to go too crazy with the upsets. There's going to be upsets. We know they're going to happen, but these teams aren't really going to go that deep. Pick those upsets in the first couple rounds and then, weed out some of the bad teams when you see some of the matchups. And again, look at it like, hey, is a team playing, a team like, you take some of these teams in the Big 12, like Iowa State. That's a team scored 30 points last night, right? Like, they do everything on the defensive end of the floor. So if they're matched up against a team with an explosive offense that might be a lower seed, they could be vulnerable there, right? So you want to look at those types of matchups when you're picking your upsets. But as far as like getting into like the Final Four or whatnot, definitely want to target those top teams because more times than not, when it gets into that area, the cream of the crop rises, and it's one of those top seeds that ends up in the Final Four.
Mm-hmm. What are some of your targets when you're looking at who could pull off an upset? Like, I look at teams that go for a lot of threes, or are very efficient at free throw shooting. Those are some like key points that I look at if I'm going to consider which teams can pull off an upset. What do you look at when you look at that?
Yeah, some of the smaller schools, right, that have a good offensive efficiency, good scoring, like Colorado State's a team like that. Some of these teams from the Mountain West, we're going to get a couple of them in the tournament, and I think they're teams you could keep an eye on. Boise State, obviously, the opposite, play very good defense, but, depending on the matchups, you want to kind of zero in on, strength versus weakness and that sort of thing. So when the seeds fall, we'll have a better idea. But I definitely think that if you can match those teams up that have, good offenses, if they get on a shooting roll, they can really make some noise. And I think we see that year after year. So that's really what I look like. A team strong offensively against, a vulnerable team that might not be great on both ends of the floor. I think you can kind of attack that. I know historically, a lot of people look at like the 5 and the 12. That's an area of where we see a lot of upsets this year. So I definitely kind of target that area more than, the top, obviously the 116. Is very rare that we see that. We saw Abilene Christian get it done, but we don't usually see those top 2 seeds losing early. But in the middle of the bracket, you can definitely find some advantageous matchups.
Have you heard about the fifth seed being the unlucky number in brackets, where they never make it far? Do you believe in that? I mean, statistically, they don't have success, but it's like an unlucky number.
I feel like we see it every year, and it kind of like reinforces it, right? But again, I think it's more of it gets amplified when it happens, and then when it doesn't happen, like we don't really talk about it too much, you know. But I think that's really it. Like that fifth seed, I think there's a lot of in that area, in that fourth, fifth seed. There's a lot of upsets, but there's a lot of good value in targeting those teams again to make it to the Sweet 16. When you set up your betting card with your futures, you don't want to pile everything into the Final Four or the national championship, but those ranges, that 5 seed, that 4 seed, they can win 2 games real easy, bang bang, with avoiding the top seed and getting to that Sweet 16 or even the Elite 8, depending on how much you like that team. I did that with Arkansas last year. Texas Tech is another team that I think, the way they play defense, they could do a lot of damage in the tournament. So teams like that I think that, can play on both ends of the floor. If you target them, those 5, 6, 7 seeds, is just to get to the Sweet 16 or the Elite 8, you could definitely make some money.
When you're building your bracket, do you start from the Final Four and then move back, or do you start from the 6 to 1? I've never tried to do it from the Final Four to begin. I just think that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I haven't, but I start with the top seeds and I kind of look at their path, right? Like, hey, where could they get tripped up? Like, if this upset happens, is this a bad matchup for them? And then that's where I kind of build as like which Final Four teams, which top seeds I think will make the Final Four, and then I kind of build it down from there. So, you start at the top, which team do you think Kentucky's going to get there? Can anyone stop Gonzaga, right? Question's going to be no, most likely. But, Arizona, an interesting team, right? Incredible depth. They can do everything you need, should definitely have staying power in the tournament, but a lot of inexperience, right? So a lot of young kids, a lot of inexperience. How are they going to be able to handle that? If they get a tough matchup, early, you could see them getting bounced out. So, I look at the top seeds and then I kind of build it down, try to work in some, try to work in some of the upsets, but I don't go too heavy on it. And, one of the interesting things, that I kind of found out, I was looking back at last year. We talk about our futures and taking, which team do we think is going to make the national championship. It's actually more advantageous if you just do an open-ended parlay with that team throughout the tournament than to actually get the futures odds. Like if you looked at Baylor, now I didn't go back historically, but I looked at Baylor last year. If you did an open-ended parlay with Baylor throughout the tournament, would have paid out like, I think it's 7.5 to 1, as opposed to the odds that you would have gotten Baylor in the beginning of the tournament were like 3.5, 4 to 1, depending, on your sports book. So sometimes like the value in the future odds, you look at it depending on the team, especially when you're betting these top seeds, might seem like a good bet, in the beginning of the tournament. But if you just bet them along the way, you might have a better shot of actually profiting more.
Mm-hmm. Do you run into this problem, the recency bias, where a team that just goes on a hot streak, trying to decide if you're going to bet on them or not, if it's just, like a hot streak, or is it something that can carry them through the tournament?
It is, but I think it goes both ways. Like we see it with the conference tournaments, right? Like we have the recency bias because we're like, hey, you know what? Like this team is really on a hot streak. They're going into the tournament, but with it being in different venues and it's just a completely different animal for these kids to play in, it's hard to see that carry over. I think it happens with some teams, and with some teams it doesn't. You could look at Baylor last year, lost in the Big 12, tournament. They weren't Big 12 champions, but then, they were still a top seed. And as the tournament went on, they were able to progress. I know being from being from Philadelphia, Villanova was a team that I was fading out the gate last year and lost a little bit of money early on because I just felt like the way that they ended their season didn't really, lend well to how they would perform in the tournament. Like, can they, really do some damage in the tournament? So I thought that they were a fade, just because of how they ended their season, and they were able to kind of turn things around and get a couple wins. So, I think it's a hard thing to gauge, but I do think some teams carry that momentum through. But, which teams are going to. I think it more depends on the matchups that they get in the seedings.
Yeah, that's why when it comes to the brackets and the tournament, I tend to go towards the more veteran players, guys who've been around 3-4 years, coaches that have been doing this a long time.
Mm-hmm.
How important do you think experience is in this tournament? I mean, you get one game and you can be out.
Yeah, I think it is. And we talked about Arizona, and that's really my biggest concern with them is that, they have so many young players. Like, are they going to be able to hold it down? But I think experience is huge because it's such a different environment, and it's a lot, and it's a lot, there's a lot of motion. It's the biggest thing going on in sports at the time. So it's hard for teams to play consistently that way. And we talked about Baylor and like, hey, if you parlayed them all the way throughout, you would have made more money than if you took them at the futures. But that just kind of gives you an idea of, you're asking them to win 6 games in a row. Like, it's a very difficult task for a college basketball team to do that, for kids to play that consistently throughout in such a crazy environment. So I do think experience helps. I think coaching also very important. I know we talked about Michigan State a little bit earlier. I think some of the Izzo getting his team ready is more narrative than, actually has teeth. Lately in recent years, but I do think it helps to have experience on your team, veteran players that can kind of calm you down, and that leadership from the coaching as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're on that spotlight. I mean, the whole nation's watching you, whether they were paying attention to college basketball before then or not. And it even helps a lot of guys draft stock. I mean, if they can get into the tournament, all eyes are on them. I've seen plenty of guys who weren't considered a draft option, and then they just go all out in the tournament, and then they get a lot of options. So do you have any sleeper teams that might be overlooked right now?
I don't have too many right now. I think it's going to depend on. I'm a person who kind of likes to see how it's seeded, and then like when I can see the seeds and I can see the matchups. Like once we get to Selection Sunday, I think we can kind of dig in and see like what the individual teams' paths are, because I do think that that's important. I think matchups are really big. When we get into March Madness, but there's always upsets, so there's going to be plenty low hanging fruit to pick off the tree as far as teams that are going to be able to make some headway. But I think the seeding really has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. So looking over in the NBA now, we just had All-Star break, couple games back in. Some of my evaluations at the All-Star break have shifted a lot after these last couple of games, primarily with the Warriors. I was really hot on them at the All-Star break. Steph Curry went off in the All-Star game, becomes All-Star MVP. Klay Thompson should be back tonight against Dallas. So I look at them, and because of the recent struggles, I'm leaning towards Phoenix to win the West this year. Where are you at right now, and who could come out on top in the Western Conference?
Yeah, I like Phoenix. I mean, I kind of think they're the best team, and I think that the Paul injury is, obviously not ideal, but I think they're going to be able to get him back plenty in time to ramp up, for the playoffs. And even if they don't, even if he's not, fully 100% available in the first round, they have the talent to where they can kind of get through. And I think they're pretty clearly the best team in basketball. I think what's interesting is when, we're looking at the landscape of the Western Conference, it seems like, people are looking at a lot of teams like Denver, like they're a hot team now. People are grabbing them in the futures market to come out of the West. And they are because of, the whispers that Jamal Murray is going to be back. They're getting Michael Porter Jr. back. They're getting a lot of people back. And Jokic obviously having an MVP caliber season. But we view injuries differently, I feel like, with the lower teams than we do with the top teams. We look at, the Draymond Green injury with the Warriors and the Chris Paul injury with the Suns as big negatives. Oh, well, if they get these players back, is it still going to click? You hear these types of things, but we're backing these lower seeds at much bigger numbers for the same exact reasons, because they're getting these players back from injury. So, I think that our perspective on that makes a big difference, but Phoenix, I think, has been, the top of the West all year. I think the Paul injury, it hurts them right now, but it's going to give guys like Cam Johnson, Cam Payne, Holiday more minutes that I think that is going to be really valuable as they get deeper into the playoffs in the West. So I think it's actually could be a positive in a way for Phoenix, having this Paul injury, as long as he comes back and he's 100% and he can stay healthy through the playoffs. I like the Suns.
And if we needed any reassurance last night, the Suns were also out Devin Booker in addition to Chris Paul. He's out with health and safety protocols. They beat Portland by 30 points, 120-90. I like how that went out without their two MVP candidates. Chris Paul, yeah, he's out. He should be back. It was like a 6 to 8 week recovery that gets him back right at the end of April in time for playoffs. He's still, even though he's out, he's still leading the league in assists. He averages 14.9 points per game, 1.9 steals before the All-Star break. I think he'll come back good. And they also made adjustments after this season, the way the finals played out. Their young guys are playing great. Like collectively, all of them are really stepping up. They have 3 centers now. Last year they only had 1. That was an issue. I do like them, but the Warriors, they let us know, hey, they're still just as dominant. I think that once they get all their injured players back in, they could show up. That's the one concern I have. What about some of the second tier teams that could come into the mix? There's a lot of hype on the Jazz and Memphis right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think out of those teams, like if we're looking at like Denver, we're looking at, the Jazz, we're looking at Memphis. I think Memphis has, the biggest opportunity or the best chance to really kind of mix things up in the West, right? To take away from the Warriors, or the Suns in coming out of it. And I think it starts with Ja Morant, but it's also, if you look at how this team has played during the season, they've really showed the ability to play well on the road. And so, when you get into the playoffs, you get in these half court games, they can lean on Ja Morant. He's going to, be one of the most explosive players in the NBA during the playoffs. I have no question he's going to be able to rise to the occasion, when it comes. But they've shown the ability to win on the road. So, the biggest challenges I feel like with Memphis is, and this is why I like Phoenix as well, is, Memphis' path to getting there is going to be beating Golden State and then beating Phoenix, right? And that's a tough path, right? So now you have to beat both those teams, and possibly on the road. They might be able to catch Golden State, but, they could have to play those two teams back to back, and beating those types of teams in a 7-game series, I think, is a lot to ask for a young, inexperienced team. They got some experience last year, but still, not as much experience as the other top 2 teams in the West.
You mentioned Ja Morant. He is clearly my favorite for most improved player. I think his odds right now are -600. Like I think that one's obvious. Actually, there's a lot of bets on him for MVP as well. I mean, he just posted back-to-back career nights with a 52-point game, a 46-point game back-to-back. I think he's impressive, but I think for MVP, I think there's a clear-cut winner. My pick is Joel Embiid. I think he is now with Harden in the mix. You would think that maybe that could take away from what he can do down the stretch. Do you think that could take away from his MVP odds?
I don't think so. I think health is really the only thing that's going to get in the way from Embiid, winning the MVP. They have the best 2-man game in the league, one of the best, at least, with Harden and Embiid. And I think they feed off each other. And I think, the stats are going to be there for both those players. And I think we've seen that again against, they played the Knicks and the Timberwolves, right? So we're going to see how they perform against, tougher level of competition. They got Cleveland, they got Miami up on the schedule. So that'll give us a better indication. But I think there's plenty of room for both those guys to flourish on the stat sheet, when you talk about Harden and Embiid. So I think it's Embiid's really award to win as long as he can stay healthy. I think that, Ja Morant and Jokic have had incredible seasons. And there's a little bit part of me, I'm from Philadelphia. Obviously, I want Embiid to get the award. But I really feel like Ja Morant should be talked in the conversation a lot more than he is right now. It just seems to be between the two centers. But it's definitely Embiid, especially if the Sixers continue to play well and kind of make a push towards that top seed in the East. It's going to make his case for MVP even more stronger.
Yeah, that was my thing when looking at MVP. The way your team performs does have a lot of influence. Usually it's a top 2 seed that the MVP player comes from. That's why I didn't look to Chris Paul or Devin Booker, because they got 2 guys to split that on one team, even though I like them to win the West. And then Steph Curry, his odds were like plus 10-1, basically. At the All-Star break. It's doubled since then. It hasn't been going great for him, but the Warriors, their run helped Steph's odds, and I liked him for the West, but I do think MVP will come from the East. Jokic, I don't think that the Nuggets are going to do him any favors. Giannis is still in the mix. It's hard to forget him. He's won it twice. He just came off an MVP finals. So what do you think about Giannis right now? I mean, it's hard to forget about the Greek freak, but he's still in the mix too. It's hard to not consider him.
He is. And he showed last year how dominant he can be when it matters. You know what I mean? But you almost wonder, I just feel like the Bucks, not sure what it is, right? Big win over the Heat. So maybe they're starting to turn the corner, but they're just going to need a lot of statement wins. And, I think Giannis is obviously one of the best players in the NBA. And, when the playoffs come around, they could kick it into a higher gear, but they've just been pretty inconsistent, haven't been great on the defensive end of the floor. Probably missed Lopez a little bit, could be a couple different factors in there. They traded away, DiVincenzo. So they've made some moves that haven't exactly panned out, or at least haven't bared the results that I think that they were looking for right away. But they're a team that's definitely going to be live in the playoffs. MVP for Giannis, probably a stretch. I really think it's going to come down to the two centers. We talk about Steph Curry, great start to the year, but lately just hasn't been shooting well. I think they're a team that, again, is kind of like not playing possum, but just waiting to get everybody healthy so they can make a push for the playoffs. And I think you see that with some of the teams in the NBA where they're not really concerned with the seeding. They're just concerned with getting everybody healthy and be able to make a strong push when the postseason hits.
Yeah, I think that Embiid's got this one. That addition with Harden was probably the most pivotal part of this whole season, I think. When the Nets gave up him, people are still considering the Nets in contention for the East. I have eliminated them ever since. I mean, for Philly, you must be excited because fans are loving Harden right now. And that's a hard fan base to win over. So how's it been going for Philly fans with the addition of him?
It's been incredibly exciting, and it's really injected life into the fan base. And it's the biggest part of this, at least for me, when I look at it, is Harden fits Philadelphia and where they're at, their franchise, very well. Like a lot of people talk about, hey, you know what? He doesn't play in the sandbox well. He's going to wear out his welcome quickly or whatnot. But with Joel Embiid, with big men in the NBA, like the Sixers window, really, if they're going to win a championship with him, is this year and maybe next year, right? And so they don't need Harden to be here in 3 years. And this year's their best opportunity because Embiid's healthy. He's at his prime. He's having the best season of his career. He's been playing consistently throughout the year, so he hasn't missed a lot of games. He's been on the floor. So I think really this is their best shot. The East is wide open. They have a good a shot as anyone else to win in the East. So, if we get good Harden, nice Harden, great teammate for this year, I think it gives them a great opportunity to get to the finals. And when you get into a 7-game series, you have players like, Harden and Embiid, as this team continues to gel, we're seeing the impact that he's had on guys like Tyrese Maxey, 20 plus points in all 3 games that, Harden has played. I think that they're live in that spot. I did a piece for Yahoo where I talked about, if you're a believer that the West is going to go through Golden State or the Suns, instead of taking the Sixers, and you think the Sixers are going to come out of the East, instead of taking the Sixers at like plus 340, you could parlay it with those 2 teams in the West, Golden State or Phoenix, and you're going to get like plus 1,100, plus 1,200 odds. So if you think that the West is pretty much down to those 2 teams, you're still getting, a better bet, a better number, parlaying it with those Western Conference teams than just taking the Sixers at the, the odds that they are now.
I like your parlay mind. They never work out for me, but you sell it well. Like now I'm like, maybe I should start parlaying again. I like those strategies. But yeah, when you look at the 76ers, they went 4 straight, and the Nets, they've lost 3 out of the last 4. And the 76ers, when you think about maybe the Bucks being a threat, 76ers beat the Bucks without Harden. Just a few nights
right before the break.
Yeah.
And it was a dominant game where Embiid had 42 points, I think, in that game. So it was a big statement.
Yeah. And I just think that when Giannis had 32 points, and so Embiid had 42. I mean, I think it's hard to bet against 76ers right now. I have Phoenix and 76ers. It sounds like you're on the same page as me for both conferences. I don't have a pick to win it all just yet. It's hard for me to go against the Bucks, but that trade, I think, was pivotal. And I think it kind of made the nail in the coffin for the Nets. What is your projection for them? I mean, Ben Simmons, is he going to get in there soon? KD, is he going to be back to healthy? A lot going on in Brooklyn.
Yeah, on paper, they're going to look phenomenal, right? They're going to get Irving back. He's going to be able to play in the playoffs. They'll probably, and then you're going to get Simmons back, for the playoffs. Obviously, is the back injury now. But, I think on paper, they're great. But when you talk about like chemistry and putting everything together and being able to win in the playoffs, I'm just not sure it's all going to come together for them. It's almost like they're probably better positioned for the future than I think the Sixers are more positioned to win this year. When you look at, the Lakers last year, it was almost like they tried the same thing, right? Where they were just like, hey, you know what? We're a lower seed, but we're still going to run the table. They were favorites. A lot of people liked them to come out of the West last year, even though they were a lower seed. Won the first 2 games against Phoenix, and then that was it, right? And then out in the first round, and I think that you'll see kind of like the same thing from Brooklyn. Like, I just don't know if being a lower seed, you can kind of go on the road, and be able to just kind of like run through the East, because the East is formidable. Like, it doesn't have that standout team that kind of like the West does, but you look at Miami, very tough defensively. Giannis with the
we
Bucks.
haven't brought them up yet.
Yeah, so there's a lot of teams there for Brooklyn to get through. So I just think their path is going to be very difficult. And one of the things that I love about the Sixers and getting the Harden deal is, now you have 2 guys that really kind of play well to the half-court game that we're going to see in the playoffs with Harden and Embiid, with how much they get to the foul line, right? So, and that's good. That's key. That's something that the Sixers didn't have. Like, the half-court game, with Simmons was great in transition, but really when it got into the playoffs and it kind of, the game slowed down, that's when they had challenges, because everybody would just kind of double up Embiid. But in Harden, him and Embiid being able to get to the foul line at the rate that they do, I think is going to be really tough for teams in the East.
Yeah, so speaking of Miami, they are leading the East. It's hard to think how easily it is to forget them, honestly, with the 76ers and what they're doing. But one thing that does intimidate me a little bit with my 76ers pick is that the past 5 Miami Heat teams to win at least 41 of their 62 games all went to the NBA Finals. So that's something that stands out to me. They do play Brooklyn tonight. I know you looked at that game. What do you think right now? I mean, Miami is on like a roll right now. They're playing better basketball than anyone in the league, really. And look how easy it is to overlook them. Who do you like in this game?
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the Nets here with the points, getting Kevin Durant. I think that, the Heat now, they're on a back-to-back, right? Last night, they had the loss against Milwaukee, a game that they really had in hand, and I think that, the Heat, depending on the matchups in the playoffs, can really make some noise. Again, the leadership of Jimmy Butler, he really gets those guys motivated when it comes to playoff time. They play solid defense, and they always seem to give Bucks problems. But last night, the Bucks were able to overcome that at home. And I just think them coming off that loss here, traveling to Brooklyn gets Durant back. So, they're going to be able to kind of, have a burst of energy, a little resurgence, like, hey, now it's time to make our push to the playoffs. Things obviously not going well for them after the All-Star break, but I think them catching points here at home, I think this is a good spot for Brooklyn.
Yeah, you mentioned that the loss at the buzzer last night. Miami, they're still 8-2 in their last 10 outings, though. And I really like the over when it comes to Miami. The over is 38-25 this season for the Heat. That's the second best record in the league. The Nets also, they've gone over the total in 8 of their last 10, and now they get Durant back. So I think that they'll put up some points. So I like the over. It's at the total's at 221.5 right now. I think that one could easily go over.
Yeah, it's a great play because Brooklyn defensively, especially like recently, not good at all, right? So, you know what I mean? So Miami team's going to be able to score a lot of points in this matchup, run the floor and really be able to light up the scoreboard. So I think it's a good play on the over as well. Brooklyn, getting Durant back, not going to help them a ton defensively. So they're still going to have those struggles.
Yeah, and I just don't know how he's going to come back. I'd like to see one game of him, or at least a few. Just like when we talk about getting back into college hoops, I want to see a little bit of him before I take a side. I would probably lean towards Miami on that one, but I do like the over here too. Another one that you let me know you were looking at was Detroit, Toronto. Miami, back-to-back games with Toronto. Now Toronto's up against Detroit, who's playing pretty well lately, whether they're picking up a win or they're at least staying competitive in a loss. What do you like here?
I like the dog with the points here. I think Detroit, they've covered, I think, in their last 4 games, if I'm not mistaken. And really coming out of the All-Star break, you're really kind of seeing this team start to make some strides, to develop, to be competitive. They're not a team that's going to lay down here in the last, 5-6 weeks of the season that we have left. And you're seeing Cade Cunningham, his impact, and some of the veterans on the team, really seeing this team fight, night in and night out. And I think that 8.5 points is a lot. Like, here's a Raptors team looked awful coming out of All-Star break in our first couple games. They lost to Charlotte. They had some bad losses. They were able to turn things around against Brooklyn, but again, it was like Brooklyn without any of Brooklyn's good players, right? So it wasn't really like, a competitive NBA team. So I think this number is a little inflated for the Raptors at home. So I like Detroit to keep it competitive and to stay within the 8.5 here.
Yeah. So when playing as an 8.5 point underdog, the Pistons are 17-13 against the spread. These two teams did face off in January. The Raptors were favored by 9.5 in that game. Pistons did cover there. They did lose, but they covered the spread. I do like that one too. Just looking at how you mentioned the Raptors have been after that All-Star break. But yeah, lots of NBA moves that happened at that All-Star break that I think just shifted the whole season and the outlook. Lots to look at as we move forward. Is there anything or any team that you think would be a real threat to our picks, Phoenix and Philadelphia? I do like where I stand with them, but they're like the Warriors could show up, maybe the Heat, definitely the Bucks. So there's some teams out there that I have a little bit of concerns with.
Yeah, in the East, it's probably the Heat and Boston, right? It's probably like those two teams, I think, that are going to threaten the Sixers the most, because the Sixers historically haven't played well against Boston, and Boston's a team, very strong defensively. Can they kind of, match up with Harden and Embiid and kind of take them out of their game? And the Heat, same thing, good defensive team, and again, they've shown the ability to win tough games in the playoffs in the past. So I think that they're kind of like the longer shots that I would look at in the East to make some noise. And in the West, I think it's Memphis. I'm really not buying into Utah. I've seen this story with Utah every year in the postseason. I can't back them. They want to run the court. They want to be in transition. Doesn't really work well in a 7-game series in the playoffs. So I don't think they're really built to go out there and win the West. And, Denver, I realize they could be getting Jamal Murray and these guys back, but I just think that when you look at these top 2 seeds in the West, I think that's really where it goes through. If a team is going to threaten Phoenix, I probably think it's more Memphis than Golden State, even though, I think that they're the top 2 teams in the West. Memphis is the wild card because, like I said, Ja Morant can really take things over. If he makes a big leap in the postseason, it could be a problem for a lot of teams.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think it'll be an Eastern or Western champion to win it all?
Well, I am from Philadelphia, so I'm hoping it's an Eastern championship. I'm going to hold on to that. We'll have to see what they look like then. I think the Suns have been the best team all year. Usually the best team wins in a 7-game series, so it's hard for me to get off them. But we're going to have to see what this team looks like, with Philadelphia. And that's the key, is if they can show the leadership and show the resolve to get through the East, I think they're going to be tough. And I think they can definitely play with Phoenix. That's going to be the key to them, right? Because, Ben Simmons wasn't a problem when they were winning in the playoffs against the Wizards. He was a problem when they were losing against Atlanta. So seeing how that team responds to adversity in the playoffs is going to be huge for the Sixers. It's going to tell you all you need to know. But if they can get out of the East, I think they're going to be live in that series against the Suns.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the Suns do have an edge when it comes to the Warriors. The Warriors have kind of gone on a 2-year hiatus, but the Suns, I mean, they made it all the way, and they kind of let that series slip away for them. I mean, Chris Paul does concern me in the playoffs. That's a little bit of a wild card, but I just can't imagine them letting that slip away again. Maybe
they're so deep. And that's really, like, the Suns have so much depth now that's really, you've seen them. I mean, they've had injuries all throughout the year, and they just roll new people in. And, they did a great job at the deadline. They got a Holiday for cash. They brought in some people there, just some pieces to kind of, build that depth for what they need in the playoffs. You talked about the center. So I think that's really the difference between them and the Warriors. You look at the Warriors and really it's, Steph Curry is really the only shot creator. Klay Thompson can, drain it from deep, but he's really the guy who creates the offense. And outside of that, they don't have much offensively. So they'll get Draymond back. He'll help defensively, but I think in a 7-game series, the Suns have so much depth, they're going to be hard to stop.
Mm-hmm. And I can't imagine Harden because the way that the Nets went out last year against Milwaukee, I mean, that was a heartbreak loss for them. I can't imagine him letting it slip away for them in Philadelphia now that he's part of a winning team as well. So
yeah, well, he knows this is his shot, right? So he knows that like his career kind of like this is his chance to win the championship, to kind of make everybody forget about Oklahoma City, forget about Houston, forget about Brooklyn. If he wins it, they're just going to talk about Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, and I mean the same goes for Chris Paul though. Like he needs to get some wins and he needs a ring. So I would love to see that matchup in the finals. But I will definitely keep up with you on this 76ers run. I'm high on that train right now, especially after that blockbuster trade. I'm all in on them. The Warriors and the Suns is a little bit of a tight one, but I'm with you. I think that the Suns loaded up and they're prepared to win the West. But definitely want to bounce back with you for brackets once we get through some of the conference championships and see where your bracket is at. So thank you so much for joining me. I know that you have your Fox Sports radio show. You're on Yahoo Sportsbook. Where else can we find you?
Yeah, so it's Yahoo Sportsbook. I write daily content for them during the week. Fox Sports The Gambler in Philadelphia. You can listen to it on iHeartRadio. You can stream it there. I'm usually on Fridays and sometimes, nights during the week, either Monday or Tuesday. And then I also do some work for the Sharp app as well. So, you can find me in those spots. Follow me on Twitter at @X_Drumheller, and you'll see all the content and all the links for everything there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Kevin will be back on tomorrow, Daily Insider. Make sure you guys subscribe right here on the Vegas Insider YouTube channel. We catch you guys giving our best bets every single day. I will see you guys next time. And thank you for joining us. Good luck with your bet.